This is the podcast for Narrate Church. Narrate Church meets every Sunday at 9 and 11 a.m. at the Grand Street Theater in Helena, Montana. For more information, visit www.narratechurch.org.
Hi, how are you? It's fantastic to be with you, though I would understand if the feeling's not mutual, because you had Vern last week and Brian the week before that, so those are a couple tough acts to follow, but I'm excited to be here, even if you want to fire me and hire them. So we are going to jump back into the surprise series, but first kind of want to take a little bit of a route before then. One day Jesus was praying, and we don't know exactly the details, but apparently the disciples were listening as he prayed. They were listening to him pray. They were probably even watching him pray, and certainly this wasn't the first time this had happened, but when he finished up, when they reconnected, the disciples looked at him and said, Hey, Lord, would you teach us how to pray? Which at the surface level is a pretty innocuous thing, but when you actually unpack it a little bit and begin to understand what was going on there's some appreciation that comes from doing that, because these were Jewish boys. These were, I don't care how churched you think you were in your background, even if you were homeschool churched, which isn't to imply that all homeschooled people are super churched, but you're right, you're with me. It doesn't compare to their experience. They were raised in first century Israel when, of course, the liturgical life, the rhythms of religious life would have been very ingrained in their routines. This was part of who they were. In fact, you could flip into the Old Testament and you could find prayers in there that they would have been praying on a daily and weekly and yearly basis. And so it wasn't that they'd never heard prayer, it wasn't that they'd never prayed themselves, but for whatever was going on there, when Jesus finished up, they seemed to have went like, hey, Lord, I don't think we're doing this right. Would you teach us how to do that? Now, that's incredibly humble. I read a book a couple years ago called Born to Run. Anybody read Born to Run? I know two Stordahl boys that I tried to get to read it, but they wouldn't. Did anybody else read Born to Run? It's those shoes you see around that have like the fingers in them, those weird things, and if you know anybody that has them, you know you can smell them from about 10 miles away. Well, those weren't just supposed to be a hipster iteration. They originally started for people who like to sail, and it gave them good grip on boats. And then this guy wrote a book where he studied some people in Mexico, and what was born from that was something called barefoot running. And I avoided the book for a very long time. I thought, I'm already weird enough. I don't need to, what I was picturing was a book that would somehow win me to this idea of running barefoot. And I thought, that's just creepy. And I live in Helena. When can I do that? 4 months out of the year? So I avoided it. But eventually I picked it up and read it, obviously. And what I learned from it was that a lot about the biomechanics of running. Because what he describes is that there are right ways and wrong ways to run, which for some of us strikes us a little bit foreign, because we've learned that there are fundamentals to throwing a baseball. We've learned there's fundamentals to shooting a basketball. There's fundamentals to water skiing. Like, there's right ways and wrong ways to snowboard. But when it comes to running, it's just like, well, just run however you run. And he argues, no, that's why people get injured. I liken that to what the disciples are doing here, because in my experience, most of us, maybe all of us, we assume that however you pray, just pray. In fact, we even say things like, prayer's just talking to God, to which I think Jesus goes, I don't know. Not sure that I buy into that rationale. In fact, how many of you guys have ever asked for someone, for advice how to pray, ever hired a prayer consultant or a coach? Yeah, or imagine what it would be like if someone heard you pray, and when you finished up, they went, hey, could we get together next week and I'll give you some tips? That'd be horribly offensive, wouldn't it? Like, they overheard you praying for your kids, or they overheard you praying for a meal, or they somehow had this device where they could read your mind, and they heard what you do as you drive to work, or as you drive home from work, or as you go for a walk, or however it is you connect with God via prayer, as we say. And they went, do you want to get together next week? Because you're doing it wrong. It's bold. And that's precisely what these Jewish boys were doing, is they were saying, I think we're doing it wrong. And really the question I want to ask this morning is, what stood out to them? What caused these guys who were had so much experience with prayer, what caused them to conclude that their approach towards prayer was off, was in many cases really, really wrong? I mean, the notion even to say, I kind of titled this weekend, just kind of, it sounds so pretentious, and it's what I was going for, is just like praying right. Because if you just walked up to your average Christian friend and went like, hey, so do you pray right or wrong? They'd go like, you're a jerk. How dare you tell me how I shouldn't pray? First time I was familiarized with this concept, just to give credit where it's due, was I was listening to a podcast a couple years ago from a guy named Andy Stanley who influences me pretty heavily. And it was in that podcast where he unpacks a lot of what I'm going to talk about this morning. I'm indebted to him for this because it was in there we started going like, hey, I think you might be praying wrong. And in fact, what he suggests is, and maybe some of you can relate to this, if you find yourself going, like, is anybody listening? Like, does this even work? Should I even be doing this? Because my marriage isn't changing, my business isn't changing, my finances are still a wreck. Like, it's not working. Should I still be doing this? What he suggested in there that caught me off guard was, well, maybe you're not getting any results because you're doing it wrong. Bold. Would you agree? Incredibly bold, I would argue. So that's what we're going to explore this morning is what if there's a right way and a wrong way to do this? Now, let me first go back to the surprise thing, because we've been in this series called Surprise, which you're kind of going, well, no, we haven't, because you've been sailing around the world for the last 3 weeks. I don't know. I've been asked how my vacation was so many times this morning. And I just want you to know that just because I'm not teaching does not mean that I'm sipping on pina coladas at Cancun. Okay, if we could just clear that up. There's lots of other stuff to do as well, and, well, those guys are just amazing. We started the series, though, back on July 11th called Surprise. And remember, we started the series because we were where we made the observation that surprises are dangerous. In fact, really what I was doing was imposing my own self-absorbed nature on you by recognizing that in my life, surprises lead me to some of my very worst moments. And I was assuming that you could relate to that. That oftentimes the things that we most regret saying, the business decisions we most regret making, the purchases we most regret making, that some of the moments of greatest sabotage in our relationships, in our marriages, at work, that they were born out of a surprise. Like something unexpected happened to us, and we weren't ready for it, we weren't anticipating it, and our reaction was negative, and then we find ourselves going like, oh man, I wish I'd had time to think about that because I would have handled it totally different. And so we just began to go like, hey, did you recognize that surprises are dangerous? In fact, we even noted that a couple thousand years ago, a guy named James, who was a half-brother of Jesus, he noted this. He said something like, hey, what causes fights and quarrels among you? He's just talking to this body of people that were paying attention to him, and they were having all this conflict with these other groups of people, and he says, what's causing the fights and quarrels among you? And then he turns it on them. Like any good counselor, like any person who understands these situations does, he knows that even if they're only 10% of the solution, that's a significant part of the solution. And he says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from the desires that battle within you? So in other words, he's saying, like, I know you want to blame them, but the problem is, and he says that you desire something, and then you don't get it, and so you kill. Now, he meant it literally. And what we noted was that that's exactly what happens to us. Or these unexpected things occur, and we lash out, and then we go, oh, man. And so that first week, we really just talked about, I think the question that we tried to walk away with was, do you even know a surprise when you see one? The idea being that if we could recognize the emotion and the feeling and all that comes with being surprised, then maybe, if nothing else, we can do nothing. And all the men in the room go, that would be fabulous. Like, how much of the damage that we do, and I'm just picking on men, ladies, you can just sit there and smell like a rose, but whatever. How much of the damage that we do is just from the fact that we were shocked, we were surprised, we weren't thinking about that. Like, we never anticipated them saying that, we never thought about that occurring, and boom. Second week, we then talked about this idea of what if we assumed that anomalies are our friends? What if we didn't treat every surprise as a bad thing? What if we actually had a high enough view of others and even God and believe that therefore some of the stuff that surprises us is actually God's providence, God's work, God taking care of us? Like, but what if it's actually sent from Him? And so that was the week. I don't know if you remember or if you were here. We have a few left, but we had these corny little notebook things, and I challenged you to just journal your surprises, to write down whenever you're surprised by something. And my thinking was, and my experience has been, that if we'll do that, then maybe that'll create enough perspective that when we look back, we'll recognize, well, I thought that was the end of the world. When I didn't get that job, when that relationship ended, when that terrible thing occurred, I thought it was the end of the world, and turns out I'm so glad that happened. So that was what those were all about. How does this have anything to do with prayer? I wish I had more time to develop this series. There's one more idea that I'd love to talk about, and if you wanted to study this further, I'd love to talk to you and kind of share some notes there. But if you only give me one more week, which is what you gave me or I gave me or whoever gave me. It's always more fun to be the victim, though, right? Like to not take responsibility and say it's somebody else's fault that the series is ending. I would want that to be prayer. Because what I've discovered in my own journey with surprises is that prayer plays an incredible role in this whole surprise thing. That prayer can help us anticipate surprises, it can help us cope with surprises, and it can help us thrive through surprises. Which is actually, incidentally, a concept that even James affirms, because going back to that, like, hey, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Isn't it because you want stuff and you don't get it, and then you're like a child and you throw yourself on the floor and you kick and scream? But look how James continues. He says, you do not have because you do not ask God. So in other words, he says, one of the major ways that you could deal with this whole surprise disappointment thing is through something called prayer. And you go, but I'm already doing that. He says, well, when you do ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. So part A is prayer is an incredible tool for us as we learn to deal with surprises. Part B, though, is there's a right and a wrong way to pray. And maybe the reason why it feels like no one's listening, maybe the reasons why it's not getting results, maybe the reason why it's not helping us cope with surprises is because we're doing it wrong. So this morning, I'm going to invite you to take on the posture of Jewish boys, ranging from about 12 to 18 years old, we think, and begin to say, like, Lord, teach us how to pray, because I think I might be doing it wrong. And in verse 6-5 of Matthew, that's where Jesus actually picks up in response to this question. And what we're going to do this morning is just kind of work through this and hopefully find a way of praying. Before we get into that, I think Jesus' prayer, I think when we do it right, it works 100% of the time. I think Jesus' prayer, when we do it right, it works every time. So let's just jump into it. He starts by deconstructing before he constructs a way to do it. He talks a little bit about how not to do it. He says, and when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites. We don't have any hypocrites in this place, especially not a guy with a microphone. For they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Now, in their culture, it was quite a bit different than our culture. We don't really struggle with this because in their culture, it was such a religious culture that part of the way that you would gain prestige within the community at large would be to do something spiritual so everyone else could see it. And that kind of shows how much different our world was, because if you went out on the corner and stood in front of your locker and tried to do something that made you look really spiritual, you wouldn't gain credibility, you would lose it. Even around here, you'd probably lose it. But in their culture, they would do these loud, big things in order to draw attention to themselves. And Jesus says this, truly I tell you, they've already received their reward in full. So in other words, their reward is the fact that people are somehow making them, or giving them more credibility. But it also hints at something that Jesus is going to return to, and we're going to return to, because it hints at the idea that there's a reward to prayer. That to approach prayer without looking for something from God in turn is actually, well, you can do that. That there is a reward. He continues, but when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who's unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret, let me stop there. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Here's a question. Do you think if we believed that it would change everything? See, Jesus is saying when you pray, their culture, they didn't have houses with many rooms, and they often didn't even have doors. We have houses with lots of rooms and doors, but he's saying, hey, when you pray, just get alone. Isolate yourself from everyone else, and your Father will see what you're doing. And I have to wonder if that in and of itself would change our approach to prayer if we just believed that. That whether we're searching for God or believing in him and trying to walk with him, that when we get alone in solitude, that somehow he sees it and rewards it. He continues, then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. So now we're back to this reward thing, and you're going, I don't think we should pray for a reward. Well, whatever, you can sound like super spiritual, but Jesus says there's a reward. And you go, but the reward has never happened for me. I pray all the time, and my marriage still ended. I pray all the time, and my finances are still a wreck. I prayed all the time, and you fill in the blank, and we all have stuff to put in that blank. Hold on, hold on, hold on. He's not saying, as we're going to unpack this morning, that you'll get what you're asked for. What he is saying is there's a reward, and I think if we can get our brains around what he says the reward is, we would rather have the one that really is than just having what we want all the time. He continues, and when you pray, Do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they'll be heard because of their many words. Now, there was a system and a belief in this day, especially among the non-Jewish people, but apparently it was seeping into the Jewish thinking. The general sentiment was that the gods were so busy and mostly indifferent that should you try to beseech them, should you try to get their attention, should you try to elicit their involvement in your everyday life, like your marriage and your relationships and your job and your kids and things like that, that the first thing you had to do was get their attention. Like it was like you were standing on the side of a 5-lane highway and you had to do something creative to somehow get them to see that you had a need and you were actually relying upon them for it. And so they did all kinds of things. They used their tone, they used their word choice, they used their faith. They would slash themselves in some cases in order to demonstrate, here's how serious I am, God. They would offer sacrifices. There were any number of things that they were doing, all presupposing that God was so otherwise indifferent to their lives that they had to do something loud to get his attention. And Jesus observes, that's kind of creeping into your prayer, guys. Don't do that. And then he says, do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. In other words, he's not indifferent and he's not distant and he doesn't turn his back to you. And the Greek thinking was that the gods had their own lives and their own concerns and their own pursuits, and thus you just got in the way of theirs. And he's going, no. Kind of like the song we'll sing last this morning, like God smiles at the thought of you, he's saying. But I do think it raises the question, like, so wait a minute, if God already knows my needs, and I've had this conversation multiple times between services, if God already knows my needs, then why ask? Like, if it's not about outfaithing God, if it's not about somehow bending God's will in my direction, if it's not about somehow getting him to so agree with my need, if it's not about getting God to do my bidding, then why pray? But I think it's worth pausing there, to think about the full implications of what's at stake here. If the only purpose of connecting with God and talking to him via prayer is to get him to do what you want, then the good news is you get what you want, theoretically. The bad news is you have no wisdom or perspective available to you outside of yourself. See, don't you often find yourself praying and going, okay, Lord, I want this. But isn't there this assumed posture like, Lord, I want it, but I think you might be smarter than me, and so I just trust you to kind of take it and like do what you need to do with this? Like, don't you have prayers in your life that you are so grateful weren't answered? Seriously, like, do you really wish you'd have married him? I mean, does everyone not have that relationship where you just go like, oh, phew, wow, that would have been a train wreck? And some of you are going like, no, he did answer that prayer, and I did marry him, and it was a train wreck. I think Jesus is saying, hey, there's this completely different approach. In fact, I think this is why the disciples went, Lord, teach us to pray, because we're not doing it right. I think what they observed was that Jesus had an agenda, he had desires, he had a priority, he was kind of a big deal, and he had pretty big dreams for the world, and yet somehow that didn't translate into his prayer posture where he found himself always telling God what to do. I think they recognized a humility to his posture, an approach to God that certainly had desires and ambitions, and at the same time didn't ask God to do his bidding, that didn't approach God as though God's job was to bend his will in the direction of Jesus. I've had some perspective on that this week as I've been kind of contemplating all this, just as I've thought about the process that the staff and us as a church have gone through in the whole process of hiring Kate. We offered her the job in early October. We had a vacant position, or at least a desire for that transition a couple months even before that. She accepted the job in late October. We'd applied all of our visa, we'd sent all of our visa stuff through by the middle of December. In our heads, we planned for her to be here in March, and we couldn't even conceive of the idea that we wouldn't have her by Easter. And you know those muscles that are good at getting what they want? I have a few of them. And our council has a lot of them, and our staff has a few of them, and we exercised every one of them to the full extent of our ability. And almost nothing went our way. Like, okay, so Kate ended up here, so something did. But every time we came across a detail, almost nothing went the way we hoped. I mean, if there was like a best case, worst case, it was worst case minus the fact that she wouldn't have come. That would have been worst case. But other than that, like, worst case is what played out every time. And as I've thought about everything that we're going to talk about this morning as it relates to prayer, and as I've thought about that situation that God has led us through the last several months, it's helped me to get it a little bit. Because I think if everything would have went my way, it would be a lot easier to, in the transition, go, okay, Lord, like, you were on my team on this one, right? Like, you were actually doing this. Like, this was your idea, not just our idea, because we're good at getting our way. And so, like, you were actually part of that too, right? Wink, wink, like I prayed. And the fact that it still happened, but it happened so entirely different than the way we had planned it, for me, just gives affirmation that, like, God was all over it. Incredible confidence that she should be here, and that this whole thing is, well, it's going to be incredible. I think when Jesus prayed, that's what stood out to the disciples, was that they didn't always strong-arm God. They weren't always telling God what to do. And listen, if that deflates your desire for prayer, if that deflates why you would even pray, then maybe you're praying wrong. Like, maybe your understanding of why we should pray is completely off. So Jesus continues, and what follows is not at all something superstitious or anything like that. He says this. He says, "This then is how you should pray." And what follows, of course, is the Lord's Prayer. Many of you are a step ahead of me already. You know where we're going. You've heard this. You're sleeping already. There's nothing magical about this. I think the disciples would have prayed it daily, liturgical style, so I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with doing that. But what follows is a new model, a new approach. And more than that, I think what follows is an entirely different way of relating to God, and an entirely different way of holding our own lives. He says this then is how you should pray: "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name." That sounds a lot different, doesn't it, than, "Hey, Lord, thanks for the day. Now I got some stuff." Like, our Father in heaven. Father, it means intimate. It means authority. It means a lot of things. Hallowed, it elicits that God is holy, that he's other, that he's separate, that he's bigger. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. In other words, what Jesus is saying here is when you pray, first just pause. Like, just recognize that you sit, you stand, you kneel before the invisible Father, that he knows what you're doing, that he knows what you're about, and recognize how big he is. Start by reflecting on his greatness, that he was here long before you got here, and he'll be here long after you're gone. That whatever it is you're worried about, that whatever it is you're holding tightly, that he cares about it more than you do, that he's in more control than you are. And here for me was one of the great Andy Stanley observations that I think if you're just going to sleep the rest of the morning, please hear this. He said this, that the longer we stay here, the smaller everything else becomes. And the quicker we run through this, the bigger everything else becomes. The longer we bask on the fact of, God, you are so much bigger and so much more wise. You are so in control. You created this whole stinking thing, Lord. The longer we dwell there, then the smaller our need for parking spots and A's on tests and a boss who likes us, the smaller that stuff gets. See, he's saying just pause there. I'm told that when you meet a dignitary, you're often instructed on what would be the appropriate way to speak to them. And I was thinking about that this week, and I find myself doing that constantly because, as many of you know, Steve Bullock, last service I said Steve Daines, and I must have had 3,000 comments like, "Hey, by the way, idiot, Steve Daines is not our governor." And I went, "Yes, I know, it's called nerves." Steve Bullock's kids go to my kids' school, and this might sound superficial, but I'll find myself going, when I go pick the boys up, okay, so if I run into Steve Daines, like, what do you, like, "Hey, Steve, how's it going?" Like, last year our kids were on the same football team, and is it, "Hey, Mr. Governor, sir? I mean, is it, "Hey, Mr. Steve Daines?" Like, what does one call someone like that? If you have any ideas, I would love to know, because I just mostly get awkward and insecure in those moments. Jesus says, hey, when you're going to talk to God, here's the title, just Father. Just call him Father. Which, by the way, elicits that he's not indifferent. It assumes maybe even a father that you didn't experience, and if that's the case, I'm sorry, but it assumes a level of interest and involvement. It assumes intimacy. But you know what? It also assumes more than that. It assumes authority. It assumes respect. And if you weren't a part of experiencing that, I'm sorry too. But part of it is not just that he loves you and wants to give you everything you want. Part of it is your understanding that he has your best interests at heart. Part of it is understanding that he knows better than you, that he's wiser than you, that he's got more perspective than you. That, you're living your life and it seems so big, but you know what? He watched Abraham live, and he watched Ruth live, and he watched Mary live, and he watched Jesus live, and he watched Moses live, and he watched Hitler live, and he's watched them all live. Like, he's got, if nothing else, more perspective than anybody else has. Pause, Jesus says. Just reflect on the fact that you even get to talk. And then he transitions. And I think this second piece, we could just, Caleb was saying between services, like we could just drill down on each of these aspects, and this one is especially true for me. But I think this second piece is when we skip it, I think this is when we pray wrong. I think when we, this is like the left turn where we do everything else right for the rest of the way, but if we miss this left turn, everything else is sullied. And I think when it comes to how can prayer help us with surprises, when we get this right, then it will completely change the dynamic that surprises play in our lives. Because then he says this. I can't even read it from my Bible. You want to see how spiritual I am? Look at this. There's a hole, which by the way is not because I'm spiritual, it's because I've been pacing back and forth all week rehearsing with my finger and my sweaty finger on that part of the deal. So it says, your kingdom come, just kidding. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. See, and I just want to get this right because there's another one of these important aspects of this deal. Jesus is teaching us, but that before we get to us, we must first surrender to him. See, in our prayer life, it's God, you're great, awesome, now I need these things. Jesus goes, no. It's God, you're great, you're awesome, you're in control. Your kingdom come. Your will be done. In other words, Lord, I got this whole bunch of stuff that I'm going to get to. I've got this kingdom, and my kingdom's important. And man, if other people just understood that I'm king of my kingdom and that they just cooperate with my kingdom and they'd recognize that, like, my kingdom's kind of a big deal and that my finances are messed up in my kingdom and my marriage is messed up in my kingdom. Like, Lord, I've got this kingdom, and I need your help with my kingdom. And Jesus is saying, before you get to your kingdom, pause, put on the brakes, and confess to God that, God, I've got some stuff I want to talk to you about, but before I get to it, thy kingdom come. Thy will be done. Lord, there's some stuff that's pressing in on me. There's some stuff that's freaking me out. But Lord, before I get to it, let me just acknowledge to you that I'm surrendered, that it's your kingdom come. See, here's the radical thing about Jesus' perspective on prayer. In Jesus' economy, in Jesus' thinking about prayer, prayer is not about imposing our will. It's about surrendering it. And is there parts of the Bible, even in Jesus' teaching, that talk about something called intercessory prayer and getting God to do things? Absolutely, there is. But it's not the default position of the switch. What Jesus says is prayer is about you surrendering your will. It's about coming before God and recognizing he's the king, he's the boss, he's the one with perspective. Lord, it's your party. Your kingdom come. Your will be done. And you know something? Do you ever find yourself wondering how long you're supposed to pray? If you've been around church for any length of time, you've went through this guilt trip, and you don't have to admit it here, but like how long, like what constitutes as prayer? How long do I have to pray? Has it been a half an hour yet? Because then all of a sudden I can feel good about myself. Has it been 5 minutes? I remember hearing many years ago about a guy who had a hardwood floor in his bedroom, and when he died, there were grooves in the floor next to his bed where he prayed. And I remember hearing that thinking, I could tape sandpaper to my knees and slide into prayer and not have that happen when I'm dead. Like, how long is one supposed to pray? And I think here's our answer. I think the length of our prayers is determined by how long this takes us. Like, the length of our prayers is how long does it take you to surrender your will? How long does it take you to go, Lord, thy kingdom come, thy will be done? See, in Jesus' life, there are instances where he prayed and it was like 5, 10, 15 seconds. When he raised Lazarus from the dead, there was this moment of like, hey, Lord, I know you want to raise Lazarus from the dead, and so I want to raise Lazarus from the dead, and so boom, let's Lazarus raised from the dead. Hey, Lazarus, how's it going? There are other times where he prayed all night. God said to him, hey, next part of the plan here, Jesus, I need you to go to the cross. And it's going to be brutal, and it's going to be painful, and it's going to be humiliating, and oh yeah, temporarily you will be separated from me. You're going to experience the worst of the worst. You're going to put all of human sin on yourself, and we can't even fully comprehend what that involved. We have guys that talk about the fact that he visited hell, all these crazy things. How long did it take Jesus to say yes to that part of God's will? It took him all night. I think the length of our prayers is determined by how long that takes us. Sometimes it's going to be review. Yep, Lord, just want what you want. And other times you might go weeks. You might go months before you give yourself permission to ask for anything because you realize that you still have this white knuckle grip and you can't go forward. I actually wanted to preach this weekend holding, those chickens, those plastic ones? I wanted to just hold one of those while I preached this weekend. And Kate and Caleb kind of told me that would be weird. Caleb with his silence and Kate with her words. But that's what he's saying. And you know something? If that's the type of prayer that works 100% of the time, when the point of prayer isn't to bend God's will in your direction, but to surrender your will, that prayer works 100% of the time. And you know what the reward is? It's peace. It's living in the reality that you live in a God-bathed world. Jesus said at one point, I want you to have my joy. I want your joy to be complete. Dallas Willard says that joy is living in the perpetual sense that you live in God's world. And because you do, it only gets better. He's in control. Thy kingdom come. Jesus is saying, prayer is, you ever have those moments where, and I'm sure I've done this, I'm sure you've done it, we've all done it, but I always get cynical when I hear it, where someone's like, well, Lord, I got a test today. He needs to know that. He knows you have a test. He even knows you want to have an A on the test. The point is, Lord, I trust you. And Lord, I can take no for an answer. And Lord, I've got this perspective, but before I give you mine, let me just remind you that I want yours. And then he continues, give us. See, he knows. That's really after, give it. I got some stuff I need, Lord. So let me run through the motions. Let me read the psalm. Let me okay, Lord, you're great, you're great, you're great. How many times do I have to say, Lord, you're great? Okay, give us. Give us today our daily bread, he says. Now, this in the Jewish mind would have brought up something different than it does for us, probably, because it would have brought up the idea of the manna. And there was this time in Israel's history where they lived in the desert and it was scorched and you couldn't support a people there, a person, let alone hundreds of thousands, a million people. And so God, he provided this manna. They'd wake up in the morning. You heard this in Sunday school maybe. They'd wake up in the morning, there'd be this bread substance stuff, and they tried to store it up for later. They listened to Dave Ramsey and said, save some for retirement, and it was just spoiled. They couldn't do it. And so they just had to learn for years and decades that your goal is that every day God has to provide. And then, years later, they're getting ready to enter the promised land, and Moses says to them, hey guys, you're about to go to a place where you're going to forget what it's like to be in want. You're going to have these great jobs. You're going to have these great fields. You're going to have all this extra produce. Life is going to be so easy. You're not going to remember those days when you were in college where the Lord literally did have to provide food for you. You're not going to remember those days where you got your first job and you wondered, how does someone survive in the working world? Maybe I'll go back to college and live on student loans. You're not going to remember those days. That's what Moses is saying to him. Remember that God had to provide. And so this isn't so much about asking, though we certainly have that permission, it is about recognizing God's provision. Lord, I'm going to ask you for some stuff, but I want your kingdom to come first. But Lord, let me just remind myself that you've always been faithful. You've always provided. I can always trust you. And then he continues, and forgive us our debts as we have also forgiven our debtors. It's the reminder, of course, that you approach God not because you're entitled to, not because you deserve to, not because you're more better than bad and more good than bad. None of those things. That you approach God because of his grace. That the fact that you and I can call him Father has nothing to do with us and everything to do with who he is. Just like you can appreciate the fact that your father loved you when you were 17 years old had nothing to do with you and everything to do with them. Right? It's grace. It's the cross. And oh, by the way, it's also a reminder that we get that permission only to the degree that we leverage it for others, that it's reciprocal. In fact, Jesus takes it so far that we are forgiving people that he says at one point, like, hey, if you're at the temple, which would have been a pretty big deal for them, it'd be like saying, like, hey, when you get your dream tickets to the Super Bowl and you're walking through the front gates of the Super Bowl, and as you're walking in, you remember that someone has something against you, get on the plane and go back home and seek forgiveness. Jesus says, like remember, you approach God as forgiven, and you are a forgiver. And then finally, he continues completely, there we go. And lead us not into temptation, for we are fully capable of finding it on our own, but deliver us from the evil one. Some of us have been raised in cultures where the point of prayer is to empty your sin bucket in anticipation of filling it back up again. And so we go and we confess our sin, and then like we can feel good about ourselves knowing full well that like we're going to fill it back up, and we intend to fill it back up, and we're going to purposely fill it back up, and that's just kind of part of our religious process. That's the opposite of what Jesus has in mind here. To say, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one, this is an expression of desire. It's an expression that says, Lord, my desire is to avoid evil. My desire is to obey you. My desire is to do your will, not to ask you to do my bidding. So, when you leave this morning, the ushers are going to offer you a card. You don't have to take it. That just has these 3 simple things on it. And I would offer it to you as a new approach to prayer, that you start by declaring God's greatness. Some of you have made an acronym that's to help you remember it. Don't start off asking. You start by declaring God's greatness. Use your own words. You can use the Psalms. You can use your own experiences. I'm really hung up right now on this, like you were here before I was, and you'll be here long after me, because it just helps me have perspective of, like, my life is like a night in the motel in Helena. He's been at work here long before I was here. He'll be in work long after we leave. So, Lord, your will, not ours. Humble. We start off declaring God's greatness, and then you move into surrendering. And here's where the surprise part comes in. Because as you begin to surrender your will, what you'll begin communicating are expectations you didn't know you had. Like you're getting ready to go on vacation with the family. People have asked, like, so how'd that vacation go, Adam, in the end of July? It went fabulous because of this, I think. Because when you start communicating, Lord, I've got these expectations, I've got this will, and boom, I'm letting go. Boom, I'm letting go. Suddenly, you'll be aware that you want things, that you're insisting upon things that you didn't even know you were. And the degree to which you're aware of your expectations, well, that's one really great way to deal with surprises. Just don't be surprised. It's part of it. Finally, then you acknowledge your dependence. And even notice then, it has less to do with, and then tell God what you need. Then acknowledge to God, Lord, I don't know why you don't want me to have a job. I need a job. I feel like I need a job. I want a job. But I'm dependent upon you, Lord. Lord, I didn't plan on being single at this point in my life, Lord. I just didn't. Not my will, but thy will be done. It's an acknowledgement of that. And remember that the longer you stay in the declaring, the longer you stay in the surrendering, the less time you'll spend in the asking. Not because the asking is not important, not because God doesn't want to know your desires. We talked about that a couple summers ago where Peter articulates so well, like just tell God what you're after, like he wants to know. But because before you get there, he'll go, okay, but let me ask you first, can you take no for an answer? Do you trust what I'm doing in their life? Do you trust me to take it this way before we bring it back around? Do you trust me? Like, are you God or am I? So it's my challenge to you. Will you just try it for a week? In fact, even if you're someone that you don't know if you're a Christ follower or not, maybe you used to be or you want to be or you don't want to be, here'd be my challenge. Just this week, Monday through Friday, just start your day this way. Find 5 minutes. Get alone. And you're going like, I don't even believe in God. So you can skip that if you want to. Just work on the surrender your will part. And you just see. See where it leads you by the end of the week. See if you're better or worse. See if your decisions are more or less healthy. And for those of you that do follow Jesus, here's my challenge. You don't have to live in the residual guilt that you don't pray enough. Because what stands out to me, and boy, I hope this doesn't sound arrogant because I have to do it too, but if you were me and you had the types of meetings that me and the staff have, I know you would make the same observation, and it would simply be this: boy, you just can't move forward with the Lord until you've surrendered. Like the moment you have something, then you hang tightly onto it, it's game over. It's like, okay, time out. Let me know when you've released that and we can go back to your heart. So will you start your day declaring God's will, declaring God's greatness, surrendering your will, and then acknowledging your dependence? If you're someone here finally, and Jesus is still a little hard for you to understand, I think this is the perfect weekend because it's all wrapped inside of this prayer. That we approach God as forgiven people, that God is keenly aware of our needs and keenly interested in us personally, that he wants to lead us into life at its best. And yet as Jesus demonstrates better than anyone else ever has, that life at its best starts through self-sacrifice. It starts by laying down our desires and receiving his. It starts by putting others before ourselves.
For more information on Narrate Church, visit www.narratechurch.org or download the mobile app, now available for iPhone and Android.